We will go ahead and get started. I need a gavel. We really should invest in one of those, you know it? A gavel? We should invest in one of those. Thanks for being here this morning. We're going to begin Matthew chapter 20 in our Bible study this morning. You can be turning there if you choose to follow along. We've been following a thread the last few weeks of this kingdom reversal motif. This is a thread that has been running through, and you could really say it runs through the entirety of Matthew's gospel, but it's become prevalent starting in chapter 19. And so what we've seen going on is kind of a reversal of the way you would expect things to be. And it begins in chapter 19 and verse 14 when Jesus, they try to bring children to Jesus. The disciples rebuke those people. Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me, for to such belongs the kingdom." And so that's a bit of a kingdom reversal. You wouldn't expect the kingdom to belong to children, but it does, as Jesus says. Then we looked in chapter 19, starting in verse 16. There's the story there of the rich young man and the juxtaposition that is being drawn out there between the rich and those who have given all in order to follow Jesus. Peter kind of brings himself to the forefront of that, if you recall from that story. The rich man, of course, was keeping all of these commands, but he still knew he was lacking something, to which Jesus said, "Sell all that you have, give to the poor, and follow me." We see that that rich young man went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. And so that is sort of the juxtaposition, comparing someone like him to someone like Peter and the other disciples who really did give everything that they had in order to follow Jesus. Now, we see, we come to this third example of this, where we come to the story of the laborers in the vineyard, beginning in chapter 20, and we see this story of these laborers who are hired at the 11th hour. That's a bit of a kingdom reversal. Something happens that you wouldn't expect, and it kind of goes against the norms of everyday society. We see that in this story here. And of course, we're working our way, and we're going to see more of this in next week's study, but we're getting a lot of foreshadowing leading up to what really is the ultimate kingdom reversal, which is what Jesus accomplishes at Calvary, where you have the Son of God, the Christ, going to the cross and dying the death of a criminal. That is, of course, the ultimate kingdom reversal. So we come now to Matthew chapter 20, and Jesus tells a parable, and this parable is sort of an illustration of this unfolding motif of this kingdom reversal that we see. So before we read the parable itself, I'll point out one thing, and it is that this parable utilizes parallelism to further illustrate Jesus' point. It's almost a chiasm, but it's not. It doesn't quite have the symmetry that a chiasm has, but it's very close. And so this is the parallelism that we see in this chapter, where you could almost divide this section into two subsections, where you have first the time is given. One is early in the morning, the other is in the evening. That marker of time kind of marks the division. Then you have, in the first section, the first laborers are hired in verse 2. Later on, the last laborers are hired in verses 6 and 7. But then you see kind of the parallel of that in the next section, starting in verse 8, when evening comes. Then we see the last laborers are paid first, and the first laborers are paid last. So there's a bit of a parallelism, almost a chiasm, but it doesn't really have the symmetry that a chiastic structure would have. But there is some parallelism that I think Jesus, in telling this parable, is showing us. And this parable also has some bookends. And it really further cements the context as to what Jesus is talking about. You see this with the last verse at the end of chapter 19, and then you have it in the last verse of the parable. And the bookends are this. And he's saying essentially the same thing, although they're worded slightly differently. The last will be first, and the first last. So what we see here is really a kingdom reversal in the sense that you have two outcomes and they're kind of switched around. So this is really not how you would expect things to be. You wouldn't expect those who are last to be first or those who are first to be last. But that's what we see unfolding here. And Jesus is going to tell this parable to sort of illustrate that point. So with that in mind, let's read Matthew 20, starting in verse 1. Jesus says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, 'You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went and found others standing. And he said to them, 'Why do you stand here idle all day?' And they said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You go into the vineyard too.' And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first.' And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to them, 'Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I chose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last.'" So we see in this parable the illustration of what is unfolding before us and what's going to ultimately unfold at the cross, this sort of reversal of the way things are. And so chapter 20 begins with the word "for" in my version. I don't know if all versions do that. I should have double-checked that. But the ESV begins with the word for the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he gets into the parable. The word there in the Greek is the word gar. It's not talking about Garfield, but it is the Greek word gar, and the function that this serves grammatically, if you're a grammar nerd like I tend to be, this is a conjunction. And one of the functions of a conjunction, that's not intended to rhyme, but it did, it is a connecting word. It connects different things. Like the word "and" is an example of that, where you're talking about multiple things, and the word "and" links them together. You have that, the word "but" is similar. It serves as a conjunction in terms of contrasting things. And the word "for" is another example of that. And so what we see happening here is Jesus is connecting what he's just said at the end of chapter 19, "Many who are first will be last and the last first." He's connecting that with what he's about to say, which is this parable. In other words, what Jesus is talking about with this parable is connected with what he's just said about the last being first and the first being last. This is an illustration of that very point that Jesus had just made. And so the subject of the parable is the kingdom of heaven. In verse 1 he says the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he gets into it. And so the kingdom of heaven is the subject of this parable. In other words, what Jesus is describing, and you got to think about what a parable is. It's a realistic, although not necessarily real story or example to make a bigger or more profound point, explaining it in simple terms that these people would understand. Sometimes we look at these parables and some of the context is lost on us, but these are things that Jesus' audience would have understood. And so what Jesus is describing, he talks about a master of a house and laborers in a vineyard and so on, but really what he's talking about is the kingdom. That's what he's talking about. And so he's talking about the kingdom using a realistic story, because that really is what parables are. It's a realistic, not necessarily real, but a realistic story, something that could happen, and using it to make a bigger point. In this parable, there are three main characters, and really you could boil it down to more specifics, but there are three main types of people in this parable. And some try to interpret it allegorically to where each person has a specific meaning and so on and so forth. I don't know if that's necessarily appropriate here. You could do that if you wanted to. I'll just get into it. Some of these are pretty obvious as to who they're talking about. You have, on the one hand, a master of the house. And the word in the Greek that's used there is oikodespotes. The word literally means master of the house. It's the word house and the word master put together is what that word is. And so it is a master of the house. This is the one who goes out and hires the laborers. Interestingly, later on, when, I'm trying to find it here. In verse 8, it says, the owner of the vineyard. That word that's owner there, it's talking about the master of the house, but that word owner there is actually the word that is most commonly translated as Lord. It's the word kurios in the Greek that is translated here as owner. Some of your versions in verse 8 may even say Lord of the vineyard or Lord of the house or what have you. But this is the master of the house. This is clearly God, I think. Then you have laborers who are working in the vineyard, and there are different laborers who are called at different points of time. So you could say you have those that are called early in the morning, those who are called at the 3rd hour, at the 6th hour, at the 9th hour, and then again at the 11th hour. So there's all these different laborers called at these different points in time. Then you have a foreman, or some versions call it a steward, and he is the one who's in charge of distributing the wages. We don't see a lot about the foreman besides the fact that he's mentioned in verse 8 when it's the foreman who's charged with paying the laborers their wages. Some will say that the foreman is Jesus. I don't know if that necessarily fits given the context of what's going on, but you could perhaps make that case. If you perceive this as being about the judgment, Jesus sitting on the throne of judgment, I don't really know, but you could make that case if you wanted to. With these parables, there's a lot of ambiguity to it, so you could make the case one way or the other, certainly. So as this story unfolds, what we see happening is the master of the house, he goes out early in the morning, that's what it says in verse 1, to hire laborers for his vineyard. And it says that he went to, where did it say that? I'm getting ahead of myself. So he goes out and he hires these laborers, and they agree on the wage that they're going to receive. And what the wage is a denarius for the day's work. They say that in verse 2. A denarius, if you're not aware, it comes up pretty frequently in the Bible. This was kind of the unit of money that they used back in that day. It would be like the dollar for us today. For them, a denarius was simply a day's wages. And so one thing that's interesting about a denarius, thinking about it, in this context for what they're doing, it is neither generous nor is it cheap either, but it's fair. It's fair for the work that they're doing. They're working a day, they're getting a day's wage. So you hear different people in politics and so on talk about a fair wage, a living wage. Well, this is what they're getting. They're getting a fair wage. They're getting a day's worth of wages for a day's worth of work. And so this is neither generous nor is it cheap, but it's fair. And that's important given what's going to happen later on. So he hires these people early in the morning. You could assume it's at what you might call the 1st hour, which is roughly 6 a.m. That's when the Jewish day started, was at sunrise. And so the master of the house then goes out at the 3rd hour and he hires more laborers. This must have been a pretty big vineyard given all these people that he's hiring. There must have been a lot of work to be done. The 3rd hour is roughly 9 a.m. If you assume that the beginning of the day is 6 a.m., then the 3rd hour would be 9 a.m. You add 3 to 6 makes 9, right? Math, right, Amos? So the 3rd hour is roughly 9 a.m. in our equivalent, thinking in that nature. So late morning to some people, to other people that might be early, but late morning. And notice in verse 4, he agrees to give them whatever is right. This is a really interesting thing, and this is going to come up later. Verse 4, he said to them, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So he agrees to give them whatever is right. Well, this kind of draws us in. This draws Jesus' audience in as to think, well, what is it that is right that he's going to give them? So this is sort of a way to draw us in and to get us curious. Well, what is it that he's going to pay him? He's giving them that started 3 hours earlier, he's giving them a denarius. So what is he going to give them? 3/4 of a denarius? What is he going to give them? We'll see at the end what he does give them. So he goes out at the 3rd hour, he brings more workers in, and then he goes out again another few times, and he hires even more laborers. So part of the idea that you're seeing with this is a big vineyard, it needs a lot of work, which kind of calls you back to Matthew chapter 9. I'll say more about that in a moment. But again, the master of the house goes and he hires more laborers. It says he goes out at the 6th hour, that'd be around noontime, midday. Then again at the 9th hour, which would be late afternoon, about 3 p.m. It says in verse 5 that he did the same. So let me read verses 3 through 5 again so you see the continuity of this. Going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you." So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. So the impression that we get here from this is Jesus is telling this story is you have this master of the house. He goes out at the 3rd hour. He says, "I'll pay you whatever's right." He does the same thing at the 6th hour, and he does it again at the 9th hour. So you can assume, based on the way that this is phrased, that the master of the house, as Jesus is saying this, is going out and promising these workers he'll pay them whatever is right. He'll give them whatever is right. He did it with the people at the 3rd hour. He does the same thing at the 6th and the 9th hour. So you could assume that it unfolds in the same manner. Then he goes out at the 11th hour. This is an expression that I think we've kind of lost the meaning of over the course of time. You might hear someone talk about, oh, he came in at the 11th hour. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense given the way that we tell time nowadays. But the 11th hour is the very last hour of the day. In this case, it would be about 5 p.m., since day ended at 6, and then it went into night and so on and so forth. So he goes out at the 11th hour, and he finds more laborers. This is very last minute. In verse 6, we see that they were idle. He found others standing, and he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" And the reason why they're idle is in verse 7. They say, "Well, no one's hired us." Evidently, unemployment was a problem even back then. And so he hires them also. You see the idea? This master of the house goes out and he sees idle people. He's not going to let people be idle. He hires them. And so he hires them too, even if it's just for 1 hour of work. Coming in at the 11th hour, that is the idea behind it. They come in and they do 1 hour of work. So then the evening comes, and the master sends his foreman to pay the laborers in verse 8. And notice who he says is to be paid first. He says, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." So he's going to start by paying those who came in last, those who came in at the 11th hour. He's going to work his way down to those who came in first. And it makes you wonder why he does this. Perhaps it's so that those who were paid, or those who are first, can see what those who are last get first, and then they realize that they get the same thing. Perhaps that's what's going on. But you see the visual of what's happening. Those who are last get paid first. Those who came first get paid last. That's part of the parallelism that's going on here. And so now we see what unfolds with the wages. We see those who are hired last, they get a denarius. Imagine you're one of those workers who came in first. You see this man who's done an hour of work, he gets a denarius. You're probably going to have one of two reactions. Either you're going to be kind of mad that he's getting such a generous wage for just 1 hour of work, or maybe you're licking your chops saying, boy, if he got a denarius, how much more am I going to get? So they get a denarius, those who are hired last. Everyone in between also gets a denarius, and then those who are hired first also get a denarius. So what ends up happening is they all receive the same wage. No matter how much work they did, no matter when they came into work, no matter how long they'd been working, they get the same wage. No matter when they worked, or how long they worked, or when they were hired. So imagine you're one of those workers who'd been there all day, working in the hot sun, enduring the heat and all of that, and you see that someone who did an hour of work gets paid for the same as you, even though you did 12 hours of work. Imagine how that might make you feel. Well, we see how they feel. They grumble at the master of the house. It's kind of, there's that old expression, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Well, this is kind of an example of that. They are grumbling against the one who's paying them. And they didn't like, and you can understand why, they didn't like the fact that they got paid the same as those who worked for only 1 hour. In verse 12, they said, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." And so what it boils down to is they don't like that they're considered equal with these other people. They didn't like that the outcome was the same. They felt like they deserved better. Well, the master answers their complaint. And what he says is, he says, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius?" So in other words, hey, I'm paying you what we agreed on. I'm not going back on my word to you, but rather I'm giving to this other person. So in verse 2, they agreed that he'd pay them a denarius, and that's exactly what he's done. So he hasn't done any wrong to this person. And then he says in verse 14, "Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you." And then he says in verse 15, "Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" Other versions might say something along the lines of, "Is your eye evil because I'm good? Or is your eye envious because I am generous?" In other words, why are you upset at me because I'm so generous? That is kind of the idea that's going on here. Do you begrudge my generosity? And there are some people who feel this way. They see someone being generous to other people, and perhaps it's out of a place of envy or what have you, but they say, hey, you shouldn't be generous to that person. You could kind of think about Jonah. Jonah didn't want the Lord to spare the people of Nineveh, and there's that whole story. Maybe not entirely the same thing, but you can kind of see the connection there. So that is the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And there are several different interpretations to this parable. Different ways you could look at it. You could do the allegorical way. If you read Bert Kaufman's commentary from Matthew, he has a specific meaning to each specific person, and I don't recall all of them off the top of my head, but it's something along the lines of the master of the house is God, the steward is Jesus, the laborers are the workers of the kingdom, and he goes on down, and he's got a specific meaning for each one. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but I don't know if that necessarily is, I don't know if that's necessary for this parable. Some will say that this is about Jews and Gentiles. The Jews have had kind of the monopoly on God and on salvation for a while. Eventually Gentiles will be included. Is that what's going on here? You could see that, but given the context, I'm not sure that that's the best meaning. This is Bert Kaufman's takeaway. Is this about some that are converted early versus those who are converted late in life? Someone who's been a Christian since they were a child versus someone who becomes a Christian in their 80s. They get the same result. Is that what this is about? You could see that. Given the context, I don't necessarily agree with that. Given the context, this is the interpretation that makes the most sense to me. Those who think that they're first in the kingdom. And the reason I say this is you got to keep in mind what Jesus is combating in the religious world at this period of time. He's combating a lot of self-righteous Jewish people, in particular the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the chief priests. These are self-righteous people, in particular the Pharisees, but the others you could include in there as well. People who thought that they were much better than everyone else. They almost held other people in contempt because they felt like they were so much worse than the way that they were. And so that tends to be the interpretation that makes the most sense to me, given the context of Matthew, given the context of what we're seeing unfold in this motif of kingdom reversal and what have you, but you could make the case for the others as well. But regardless of the specific meaning, there are some truths from this parable that we can, of course, gather and that we can learn from and apply to our lives. One thing that gets lost on some people when they read this parable is the fact that the kingdom has laborers. People get caught up on, well, what's the reward, and so on and so forth. But we need to remember that the kingdom has laborers. And you notice what the master of the house is doing in this parable. What he's doing is he's going out and he's getting more laborers. He can't have enough laborers. You could say the same thing about the kingdom. You can't have enough workers for the kingdom. We certainly have a shortage of it today. And I don't mean just preachers, but I mean Christians in general. And so what we see from this, the master of the house goes and he finds people that are idle. He calls them to work for him. What we see in this is we cannot be idle and expect any wage or reward. If you're called to go work in the master's vineyard, you go and you work. And if you work, then you'll get the wage. It is those who work in the vineyard who will receive the wage, not those who stand idly. And so when it comes to the kingdom, there are laborers that are needed. And this recalls, of course, what Jesus has said already in Matthew chapter 9, when he says to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And keep in mind, in Matthew chapter 9, this is after Jesus looked and had compassion on Israel, because he realizes they're like sheep that have no shepherd. So he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly for the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. We have a laborer shortage in the kingdom. And so we need to pray for more laborers to come and to receive that wage. So that's one truth you could gather from this, simply the fact that the kingdom has laborers, and we are those laborers. We need to be those laborers. Secondly, and this is really interesting to me, in verse 4, the master of the house says, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So that's what he says to them at the beginning, before he hires them. Whatever's right, I'll give to you. Well, we see what he does give them. He gives an equal amount to those who work for 12 hours, those who work 9 hours, 6 hours, 3 hours, and even 1 hour. They all get the same. And so what we see in this is that whatever is right for the master to give to the laborers, it is not based on merit. You hear in our society today a lot about a meritocracy. And in our society, I think that's appropriate for certain things. If you're flying on a plane, I would want someone who is flying it based on merit, not based on anything else. You want someone who can actually fly the plane and fly it well. You could say the same thing about the restaurant you go to. You don't want someone cooking your food who doesn't know what they're doing. You're liable to get sick if you do that, and so on and so forth. And so in our society, there's a lot that's made about merit and people being hired and having jobs and so on based on merit and not based on anything else. But the kingdom is not like that. And so in a way, this is sort of a reversal of what you would expect. In society, we reward people based on merit, or at least we probably should in certain areas. But the kingdom is not a meritocracy. We cannot merit our way into heaven, right? We're saved by grace. That's the idea in that we don't earn salvation. There's nothing we can do to earn salvation. We're saved by God's grace. That's the idea behind that. And this is also true in the sense that there's not any one person who's more deserving than the others. This is sort of how the Pharisees thought of themselves. They thought of themselves in this self-righteous way. They're better than everyone else. And perhaps their view of eschatology and their view of heaven and so on, perhaps their view was a little skewed in that way, in the sense that they felt like they were more deserving than other people, and perhaps they would get a better reward than other people. Well, what we see here is that the kingdom is not a meritocracy. It's not like you're more deserving so you get a bigger reward. It's not like that at all. Those who are in the kingdom, those who are working in the vineyard, get the same reward. Reminds me of a story. Jim preached on this pretty recently, I think, from Luke 18. This is the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And you can kind of get a glimpse of the Pharisees' in general attitude with this one particular individual as Luke tells the story in Luke 18. When the Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. We see the attitude of the Pharisees here in this particular person in the sense that instead of focusing on God and focusing on holiness and so on, he's focused on being better than other people. That's not the way the kingdom is. It's not about being better than the other people. It's not like when you're trying to outrun a bear and you just have to be not the slowest person. It's not like that. It's not a meritocracy. We get an equal reward. And the third thing, and this is kind of related to the second one, what we do receive is only because of the generosity of the master of the house. It could be easy to be kind of the opposite side of the same coin, where you're one of those workers who came in at the 11th hour, you get a denarius for an hour's work, you say, boy, I'm a hot shot, huh? I got paid pretty handedly for just 1 hour of work. That's 12 times what he should have gotten. But what we see is it's not because of anything that they did. It's because of the generosity of the master of the house. He says again in verse 15, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me, or do you begrudge my generosity? We see that this is because of the generosity of the master of the house. It's not because of anything good that the laborer has done. It's not anything of that effect, but instead it is the generosity of the master of the house. He chooses to give us more than what we deserve. The word for that is grace. Grace being undeserved merit or undeserved favor. It's kind of the opposite of merit when you think about it. By definition, it is the opposite of that. We're getting something that we don't deserve, something good, something beneficial that we don't deserve. We haven't done anything to merit that, but he chooses to give it to us anyway. And so there's a lot of takeaways you could have from this story pertaining to the outcome of eternal life. We all get equal outcomes, and so on and so forth. It's not based on merit. But there's another takeaway that I want us to have, and this is leading up to where we're going to be next week and ultimately where we're going to end up with Jesus on the cross. Because this parable, it also shows us the coming reality of the cross. We've seen a lot of foreshadowings already in Matthew's gospel account, things leading up to the cross. The foreshadowings are going to become more intense as we make our way. And in fact, the very next section, Jesus is going to tell about his death for what I believe will be the third time in Matthew. And so this parable shows us the coming reality of the cross. And here's what I mean. We've already said it. The kingdom is not a meritocracy. This is true, on the one hand, of those who are unworthy are rewarded. That's God's grace that he shows us. He gives us the opportunity to be saved. But the flip side of this is also true in the sense that there is one who is worthy, and yet he takes our punishment at Calvary. So this is the ultimate kingdom reversal. So you have those who are unworthy who are rewarded. Compare that to the one who is worthy, the only one who is worthy, the only one to come to earth and live a sinless and perfect life. And yet he takes on our punishment at Calvary. He dies the death of a criminal, surrounded by other criminals. And he does that for you and for I. And so coming to the end of the parable, Matthew 20 and verse 16, Jesus says it again, just as he said in Matthew 19 and verse 30. So the last will be first, and the first last. What we see here is a glimpse ahead at Calvary, because those of us who are last will be made first by the one who is first, making himself last. Those of us who are last will be first because the one who is first will make himself last by going to the cross, by dying there, by taking our penalty, death, by dying in our place so that we could have that hope of eternal life. Any comments or questions? Garfield?
Went through the lesson. Years ago, I was in a Bible class, and I heard the guy was teaching the class, and he was at Otisville, and he made this statement. He said, "We don't work to be saved. We work because we are saved."
Right. Yeah, if you didn't hear Garfield, someone a long time ago said, I don't know how long it was, I don't want to make you sound old, but I do that sometimes, so that wasn't my intention there. Someone said, we don't work to be saved, we work because we're saved. And that coincides exactly with what Paul says in Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. We're saved by grace through faith, not of works, so that no one can boast. People often take that and they misapply it to say we're saved by faith only. By faith they mean belief only. But faith is belief that's accompanied with works. And you can see that in what Paul says in the very next verse, in verse 10, when he says that we're created in Christ Jesus for good works. That's our purpose in Christ Jesus, is for good works. So, like Garfield is quoting, someone is saying, we don't work to be saved, we work because we're saved. And you can coincide that with James and all of that. Brad?
One of the things that hinders us from taking it in a literal way is that those of us who have been members of the kingdom are privileged. We feel it's a great honor to be a part of the kingdom. It's not a labor. It's the honor that we have that of being a part of the kingdom. It's not like the labors, but those who are first, they think that it's a labor. They think it's work, and so they work hard. They deserve this. And we don't realize that. We don't think of that way.
Yeah, if you didn't hear Brad, he points out that we may not necessarily think of this in a literal sense, because if we're part of the kingdom, we realize that that's a blessing more than it is a chore. That's actually going to come up in my sermon later on in 1 John 5 and verse 3. The commandments of God are not burdensome, right? And so it doesn't feel like we're really laboring, although there is work and labor that needs to be done. But you take the flip side of that, and the ones who were first, they felt like they've been working all day. And we are in danger when it feels like it's a chore more than it is a blessing to be part of the kingdom. All right, thanks for your attention.